So once again, welcome everyone who's attending. This is our third Solidarity Art Project event. This is a U.S. Embassy grant project. So first and foremost, we want to thank them for the generous support that they've offered to make this project happen. My name is Joanna Pottle. I'm the project director, and I'll also present Jack Holloway, who's a curatorial assistant and will be the primary monitor for the event today. Today, we'll be talking with both Brandon and Alex here about the topic of what does making create? So bookworms, niche art forms, and starting from scratch. We're looking at how these bookmakers and illustrators, multifaceted creative people, how they employ different ways of discussing really new ways of being, of thinking and making through creating books. So without further ado, I want to pass the floor over to Jack, who will introduce our first speaker today.
Thank you, Joanna. And this is my wife, Debbie. Hi. Also an artist. So she's joining us today as well. I'm Jack. I'm the curatorial assistant for the Solidarity Art Project. I myself am an artist. I'm a musician and a writer and a photographer. I went to Union Theological Seminary for my Master of Divinity, and at Union I met Brandon Harrington, our first speaker today. I've known him to be a very thoughtful and reflective, philosophical soul, very critical, like very well versed in critical theory. And maybe we can hear some of his thoughts from his thesis that he wrote on hope or hopelessness, which was it was very great to talk to him during his time working on that. I think we were kind of like both in a competition on who could write the longest thesis, and after our year, I think they really cracked down on how long you could write your thesis because they were quite long. And I think Brandon's ended up being much longer than mine. If you want to learn about me at all, I'm going to throw my link in the chat. This is just my link tree. And without further ado, I'll introduce Brandon. Brandon is a self-taught bookmaker based in Brooklyn, New York. His practice explores how the intangible relationships between book objects and users might inform book construction. While most bound paper materials are products of mass manufacture today, the historied art of bookbinding is an increasingly niche craft. Rather than ignore the experience of the book as a mass-produced object, Harrington creates constructions inspired by the material sensibility of mass manufacture, executed through hand bookmaking techniques. He has completed numerous custom commissions since 2016, when he began binding books and journals. Actually, he also offered, I don't know how many theses you did, but I know that some of my friends got actual bound books of their master's thesis because of Brandon, which was very exciting. And then I had an old book that was like really getting down in the dumps, and I sent it over to Brandon and he bound it for me. So now this classic gets to stay alive for another however many decades. So yeah, that without any more, howdy do, here is Brandon Harrington. Thank you, Brandon, for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited. And thank you everyone for who's joining today. I guess first I'll apologize to my thesis readers for the length of my thesis. Thank you for reminding me of all that. It feels like another lifetime ago already. But yes, my name's Brandon Harrington. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm just going to share my screen so we can get started. As Jack said, I'm a self-taught bookbinder based in Brooklyn, New York, and with today's overarching question being, what does making create? I'll be talking about making books, but focusing on how we relate to books as objects and how book objects are involved in both how we relate to ourselves and to each other. So in the shortest possible terms, the question, what does making books create? I think making books creates relationships. Before we jump in, I want to thank everyone involved in the Solidarity Project, especially Joanna, Jack, and Julia. And I also want to thank Alex Bildsoe, who I'm excited to be sharing this time with. And I really look forward to Alex's talk after this. A brief note, I used many in progress photos as backgrounds on these slides, and there are small captions at the bottom of the screen, right down here, that kind of explain what you're looking at. But if anybody has any questions or wants clarification on what's going on, we could hopefully get to that in the Q&A period. So I wanted to start by talking about how I kind of got into bookbinding. So I was in graduate school, and as one does, I was reading a lot. And I had all of these loose leaf PDF articles that I printed and just loose papers lying around. And I found this incredibly frustrating. So I started sewing them together. I've always thought of reading and writing as very physical activities. So I can absolutely tolerate reading books and articles on a computer or an e-reader, something like that. But I much prefer to be reading with something very tangible that I can take notes on in the margins, or writing, actually handwriting. But as I started getting into bookbinding, I was watching a lot of YouTube videos and just learning about the different techniques and whatnot. And I quickly became infatuated with the craft as an exercise in resourcefulness. So what do I mean by that? Bookbinding is very niche, and this kind of presents the challenge of learning techniques, finding materials and tools that are rather difficult to source and isn't widely available. So immediately, improvisation was really key to my journey into bookbinding. And I was trying to approximate some of those characteristics that more established bookbinders with more resources were teaching me about. But in addition to this resourcefulness kind of exercise, I was really allured by the DIY factor. So as I said, I enjoy journaling, I enjoy writing, reading, and this idea of being able to print on demand, books on demand, or create a new notebook for myself was really appealing. And it also granted me this opportunity for customization. So I could kind of create book objects that attended to my own peculiarities. I can make books the way that I like books to behave, the way that they lie flat and the paper quality and things of that sort. Making a book according to need, basically. So the craft itself is also incredibly technical, but also intuitive. So on the one hand, you have to measure things within a millimeter or a fraction of a millimeter. And at the same time, there's kind of this tactile sensibility through the repetition of different processes like sewing and gluing, where there's these opportunities for artistic expression. I think it's kind of difficult to describe, but it feels that way, if that makes sense. So let's talk briefly about book structures and what actually goes into making a book, if you're not familiar. Because I think today, most of us, the majority of us, are probably more familiar with mass-produced books. Handbound books are usually encountered more as artifacts in maybe a museum or an old library. And I know that I took for granted the construction of books until I actually started binding them. And part of this is because book structures typically conceal the means of their own construction. They conceal all that stuff that actually holds them together. But the basic components of a book are fairly straightforward. So you have paper, or something that goes in the book, pages, maybe loose sheets, or groups of folded papers called signatures. You have materials and some kind of method that holds all those pages together, thread or glue, although there are many other things that hold pages together. And then some kind of protective covering around the pages, a cover, soft cover, hard cover, whatnot. And then a means of attaching that cover to the pages, or the text block, or book block as it's called. And the way that the cover is attached to the text block, again, is one of these kind of concealed situations, so you don't really encounter it as you use a book. A book should just work, right? However, handbook binding, even though book structures are technically pretty simple, it quickly becomes very complex. And that's with sort of structural and decorative elements, like, for example, end bands, which add some kind of protective element to the top of the and bottom of the spine. Here's one in progress. It's very simple, but it's a skill set in and of itself, right? Then you have other decorative elements, maybe like gold tooling, which I've never really gotten into, but here I've pictured some decorative papers that I made by sprinkling acrylic ink onto paper. And then, you have other elements that you can kind of spiral off into, for example, creating your own book cloth. So I've been treating fabrics differently so that they'll be amenable to covering book objects. All to say that the relatively kind of simple structure of books leads to all these endless customizations and opportunities for both technical craft and artistic expression. But I'd like to take a step back real quick and talk about the access to books historically, because of the fact that handbound books are not very commonplace objects. And there's a reason for this. Books in general have only recently become accessible on a mass scale as objects because of mechanization. And that really didn't take over until around the 1850s. But there's two main factors in the historic inaccessibility of books that I'm particularly interested in. So first, books were not necessarily widely available because I think books are objects of power. And we can think of many examples of this. So you could think of white slaveholders restricting books from enslaved Africans and policing literacy learning in the first place, gendered and racialized restrictions on education. And then even after mechanization, books, when books were more widely available, custom fine bindings, hand-bound books, continued to serve as a status symbol of wealth and power. If you've ever been to the Morgan Library in New York City, you can see that a lot of those custom hand bindings were, a status symbol. The book has also been a locus of controversy itself in its physical form. So you can think of book burnings, banned books, all suggesting that the history of the book chronicles a history of power. And I think there's something about the physical form of the book and its ability to be distributed, hoarded, chained up, valued, said to be invaluable, trafficked, printed with, potentially dangerous ideas and things like that. All of these elements explain why books have such a legacy of inaccessibility. But of course, there's the other reason, which has to do with manufacture and the limitations of time, materials, and production processes that limited books' availability on a wide scale. So for the majority of books' history, it was really difficult to make them. And I'm not a historian or anything, but you could almost say, for example, that books needed to wait for paper to be invented in China around the early 2nd century CE before, there was any hope that books could become a commonplace object, right? So when I engage bookbinding today, I'm not very nostalgic about book objects that aesthetically recall this history of inaccessible books. They're beautiful objects. There's a lot of craft and skill that goes into making them, honestly, beyond my own personal, capabilities. But coming into bookbinding in the United States in the present day, mass market paperbacks and mass produced hardcovers and things of that sort are almost mundane objects. And we can absolutely talk about where and why in the United States books may not, are not still accessible. But I'm very interested in the book form as a very commonplace utilitarian object. As a bookbinder, I encounter a world of books under this condition of mass manufacture. But I don't find this boring. And I hope you can agree or access somehow that appeal of a new book or a fresh page in a journal or notebook. And I'm a child of the 90s, so I grew up around a certain aesthetic of mass produced manufactured objects, even mass produced foods, inexpensive, kind of brightly colored utilitarian objects. And I see in the minimalism of stationery today, uh, sort of all of this same aesthetic replicated, maybe in book cover art as well. So I don't find this repulsive. I actually kind of find it alluring. And you know, as far as book use and stationery goes, there's still an appeal towards this, analog recording. I use a paper planner myself. I journal a lot in notebooks, right? So, and I know other people do as well. Otherwise, these objects wouldn't exist. Um, so book objects, even as mass-produced objects, present a really intimate relationship with their users. Um, but there's also this kind of commonality that exceeds the individual in this attraction to maybe newness or the freshness of books. And that's what interests me. Book objects, especially thinking about like a journal or something like that, can be extensions of the self. And for me, hand binding actually ramps up that intimacy of the relationship. So when I create a journal, which ironically I actually don't really like to use the notebooks I create, the construction of it always reflects what I need out of a notebook or what someone else needs out of a notebook. It's building that relationship in the very construction of the book. So for my practice, rather than shun the mass-produced nature of books, I actually want to try to replicate or capture that new book, fresh page experience, but in a way that's customized, individualized. The question that I always ask clients who I'm doing commissions for is, what notebooks have you enjoyed using? And usually I'll take elements of those notebooks and integrate them into the construction of the books, so that I know that whoever inherits the book will continue creating it and building a comfortable, enjoyable relationship with that book. So sharing some of my works, I wanted to start with a journal that I actually made for myself that I think most directly illustrates kind of what I'm talking about. So it has bright color blocks, and at the same time, it uses these very traditional techniques. It's a rounded and backed case-bound book. And rounding and backing is this process of hammering the spine into a curve with an overhang that grants structural integrity to the book. The cover was made separately and attached. So covers are also called cases. That's why it's a case-bound book. And it's covered with paper that I coated with a matte finish that created a really durable surface. It actually almost has a plasticky feel to it. So there's this strange collision, I think, in this notebook between the material sensibility of something that is mass produced, but constructed with handbook binding processes. Another project is was inspired by, well, should hopefully look sort of familiar in terms of its structure on the right, because it was inspired by Moleskine. And the person I made it for uses Moleskines frequently. And we discussed making something kind of thicker than a typical Moleskine, having more pages and whatnot. So I was able to, again, kind of riff off of a typical design, but add these custom elements through handbook binding techniques. And I also wanted to embellish it a little bit with, um, as you can see on the right, a hand sewn end bands and different covering material, but it's got that band enclosure and a very kind of straightforward minimalist structure. I also used higher quality paper, so you know, it was better, hopefully, than a notebook that you could just buy anywhere. Another project that I did were these pocket notebooks that used upcycled roadmaps of New York City. And I actually made these as a gift for my siblings. I was interested in using roadmaps because of the quality of that paper. Roadmaps are, you know, outdated but utilitarian object nonetheless, and that paper was made to endure kind of the use of a roadmap. So the folding or unfolding, attempted folding, and so forth. And as I said, these were a gift to my siblings, and it was a way for me to also share my love of writing with them, but also share a bit of my home, the place that I call my home now. All right. And the last project that I wanted to share with everybody um, was also for someone who talked about really enjoying using Moleskines, but was also very interested in something that was more sustainable than a notebook that you just fill up and then kind of store or throw away, recycle or whatever it might be. So I was thinking about sustainability and how I could try to capture some of the experience of using a nice notebook like a Moleskine. So I borrowed from a typical kind of traveler's journal style, if you're familiar with that. Basically, a notebook that can take refill uh, notebooks, and it has a durable cover to protect the notebooks inside. This was kind of a mashup with the basic Moleskine structure. It has a stiff spine, a flexible cover that I made with paper-backed waxed canvas, so it's very durable. There's a band enclosure, just like a Moleskine, and a pocket in the back. But the actual pages themselves aren't even sewn together. They're just loose and they're held into the cover with elastics. So I was trying to replicate the experience of using a multi-signature notebook like a Moleskine, but one that you can add new pages and use the same cover over and over again. The last thing that I wanted to talk about today is the way that my practice and my reflections on my practice have been impacted by the pandemic. So bookbinding can be an incredibly solitary experience. It requires a lot of focus and time. And of course, during lockdown and without going to a lot of places, I have had that opportunity to focus a lot more on my process. But ironically, in the past year and a half, I've actually greatly increased my engagement online with other bookbinders. We're kind of dispersed globally, and I didn't really know anybody who was making books until I started connecting with bookmakers online. And I found that it's a really generous community of artists who are willing to share their knowledge. So so this is wonderful considering that it's a really niche craft and difficult to acquire the skills, materials, and tools that really open up what bookbinding can be. So for me, the attraction of bookbinding, in terms of resourcefulness and whatnot, was reflected in the conversations and connections that I was making online. So for example, I would post a project and others would comment, oh, you can use this material as a workaround, or this technique as a workaround, or you can buy this alternative that at a local craft store rather than an expensive bookbinding supplier. But also with this, there's a process of archiving that I see happening here, of a very niche craft that is being chronicled by the people who are sustaining it and keeping it alive. And this really opens up doors for people like me who are teaching ourselves how to bookbind. There are even tool lending groups that make it possible to try out less accessible areas of bookbinding, like gold tooling and things like that. So this past year and a half around, I've actually been able to remove a lot of the roadblocks that were holding me back in my practice, with things that I was trying to find solutions for independently. Thankfully, a lot of other bookbinders have kind of come to my aid and shown me workarounds. But on an even broader scale, I've been thinking about the themes of solitude and community, both of which have absolutely been at the foreground of COVID times for us. So, across the globe, individuals and collectives have been experiencing extreme trauma in the past year and a half. And in the United States specifically, we've not only faced the pandemic of COVID, but the persistent pandemic of racism, anti-Blackness, anti-Black violence, police brutality, anti-Asian hate, and so forth. And processing these things happens in solitude, but also, collectively. And one thing that I've been reflecting on a lot is it seems like the volume, at least, has been increased on community building through things like mutual aid networks and things like that. So I'd be delusional to think that bookbinding is, contributing in any way on that scale or in that character. But for me, these themes are reflected both in the way that I focused inward to find some peace in bookbinding, but also outward in terms of the connections that I've built with clients and friends during the pandemic, kind of through the medium of bookbinding. So I've done some online workshops. I've met up with some friends, and we talked about how to make books, and it was just kind of like a really nice way to get away from things. But I also, as I mentioned earlier, really like to have conversations with whoever I'm making books for, because it is such an intimate process to handcraft the book. And I really want to make sure that the person I make it for feels comfortable using it. So I've built a lot of connections, gotten to experience bookmaking as a conduit for building deeper relationships. And again, notebooks being objects of self-reflection, they can take on a very intimate role in someone's life. So I've enjoyed kind of being involved in that process. So I suppose overall, through the pandemic and making notebooks, it has been a way of reflecting on how community is built, thinking about what people need to process a myriad of life experiences. So that's what I have for you today, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Brandon. This was a very wonderful discussion. I have questions, but they're almost more reflections, because so many of the avenues that you went down were so inviting, as far as like inviting imagination, I think. Like talking about books as objects of power. I just recently read the Frederick Douglass biography that came out recently, and he talks about when his he starts to learn how to read he's being taught how to read by one of his I think the slave master's wife or something. And when the slave master finds out that she's teaching him to read, he says like, no, you can't do that. It's dangerous. As soon as he learns how to read, he's going to want to be free. And Frederick Douglass in his autobiography says like, yeah, that's what happened. As soon as I learned how to read, I wanted to be free. I was like aching to be free. And that's what started my just insatiable desire to liberate myself. So I guess a question I have about that is, do you kind of see book making as a kind of way of reclaiming power, or like taking up power? Because, you know, I mean, especially in a day where in order to get a book published and have your own, you know, have your own book that like has your name on it or something, like that is a power that like most people don't have access to. So is this a way for you to kind of reclaim your own power as like a an artist and like a writer?
Mm, Thanks for that question. I don't think we need necessarily people like me reclaiming power, you know, but you know, I think what you're getting at too is you know, just the ability to produce content. You know, I mean, that's the at the broadest level, kind of at the base of it. And it's never been easier to maybe publish your own book now. Yeah, obviously, getting it out to a mass market or something like that is still challenging. So there's a distinction, I think, between uh, self-publishing and making book objects. But for me, I think, and I was trying to get at this in the presentation, the creating notebooks to me has really taken on this really important role, because with a notebook, it can be much more personal, just in terms of an outlet, uh, a a refuge, and things like that. And if I can provide that to other people, who can either you know, use that for their own benefit or as a jumping off point for whatever creative endeavors they have, I'd much rather be contributing to that uh, enabling than something else. I don't necessarily need my book objects to be more than that.
Cool. Thank you for sharing. And for those who have questions, I do want to include questions from the audience, so I'll keep my questions short. Um, but I wanted to ask also about kind of books as kind of sacred objects, you know, like, and you talk about really wanting to give somebody something that is geared toward them, and like actually is kind of rewarding for them to even just hold. And I often think about like how awesome a like crisp new book is, you know, like especially like if it's like a hardcover, like when I got Barack Obama's A Promised Land, and it's like this huge tome, and it's got his face on it, and it's like perfectly crisp and like perfectly made or whatever. It's like kind of there's like a reverence there of like, wow, this is like gold almost, you know. And I have this similar relationships with records and stuff, and I was just wondering if what your input on that was, like what is it that kind of makes these objects like awesome or sacred?
Yeah, uh, that's a great question. So the first thing that comes to mind for me is and I've told this to people who I make books for. I say, you know, if you treat this well, it's going to outlive you. You know, because and I don't even mean in terms of the materials, in terms of the construction methods, the handbook binding techniques. We're oriented towards making books that can last for centuries, and I think that there's something in that physicality, that it's tangible, right? So you kind of experience it as something that will last in perpetuity. And of course, as I was trying to get to in the presentation, the historically a lot of those books that were made with traditional handbook binding techniques, were sacred texts. The photo that I chose was a chained library from a cathedral in England, and now, maybe we don't have the same kind of reverence for books because they're mundane objects, but they nevertheless, um, in their physicality, kind of speak to archiving something in perpetuity. So it's a piece of history as well. I actually I have my own little piece of bookbinding history. It's just I found this at a library sale, but it's a hand-bound book, and it was published in the 1800s. And it has beautiful craftsmanship and everything. And I experience the same kind of allure to this as I do to a fresh notebook. It speaks to a different history, and it speaks to a different kind of community around that book, or whatever it might be, if that makes sense. And we can kind of encounter that with different book objects.
Thank you for that. I'll have one more question before I open it up to the audience. You talk a lot about relationships and resourcefulness and community and doing it yourself, and as a kind of way to create together, and like how everybody say hello to Lova. How our own interests can connect us, and I'm wondering, it kind of seems like there was a more I don't necessarily want to say systematic, but like an intentional, like, underlying philosophy of community and resourcefulness. And I was wondering if you could give us like a window into kind of other areas of your life where you kind of see that happening.
Mm. I'm going to try to answer that question. So, the way that we know each other, Jack, is through our time at Union Theological Seminary, and I'll try to get at that thesis question. But the basic premise of my master's thesis was that hope, at least when white people hope, it usually undermines actual action, and it's kind of a self-soothing kind of practice, right? So when I think of community, I think that it's necessary to be very honest with context that you find yourself in, and I'm losing the question a little bit, but basically what I want to get at is, in order to be a participant in community, I think you have to be honest with yourself, and in order to be able to hear others, to build empathy and so forth, and rather than hold on to certain narratives about who we are and who we are together, I think it's necessary to have these conduits to really reflect and externalize yourself privately, communally, and judge whether or not we really have an honest relationship with each other. Does that make sense?
Certainly, journaling can aid in that work. We have a question from Annalise. You want to ask your question now?
Yes, hello.
Hi.
I came in about 8 minutes late. I apologize, and I'm so glad that I joined because I thought this conversation was great. I also collect notebooks. I'm here in Krakow with, I think, probably a few people on this call, And I literally have hundreds, perhaps, that I'm not quite sure how I'm going to get back to the US. So I appreciate the artistry involved. My direct question is, I would love, how would I join these groups or these blogs that you're talking about, these groups of people who share this particular niche interest? That would be my direct question. And then just the observations that I noticed being an American living on this side of, I've lived both in Russia and Poland. And just speaking to your point about reverence, revering books. I've noticed, for example, books that looked just purely, for lack of a better word, ick, right? And on the shelves in Poland or Russia, and saying, there doesn't seem to be so much value, and having this kind of American urge to clean. And they said, oh, no, it's a book, no matter how not valuable it seems. So just that part, kind of this, just noticing this kind of European versus American view about the mass production. And then just inside of that, what do you think about self-publishing, and self-publishing on Amazon, which seems to be a bit of a hypocrisy. I'm just curious what you think about that. There's so many things but I'll just leave it at that.
Okay.
So many things that you said that I just thought were amazing. I collect pens. I mean, just awesome discussion.
Yeah, I do as well. So actually my Instagram, which I think my handle is in the chat, it's at Write and Bind.
Oh my God, are you kidding?
Yeah, so I absolutely collect notebooks myself, as well as pens and whatnot. It's sort of an infatuation, but it absolutely informs kind of my practice as a bookmaker. As for connecting with communities, I mean, you can definitely check out my followers list. It's kind of a list of a lot of bookbinders, but there are plenty of Facebook groups. You can just search for bookbinding, and they're out there for sure. What else did you raised a lot of really great things.
Yeah,
really
sorry about that. I was just just quickly, you were talking, you're talking about reverence, and I got
Yes.
that. And then it was a discussion. And so as a woman, I also can identify with Frederick Douglass in that was kept, that, not to educate women. So there was that part. I can identify with that, right? I can identify with that narrative. But I'm very interested, because I'm American living in Europe, this idea between the European versus American view, and I'm broadening Europe to include Russia or any of this, this mass produced, like you said, kind of, we take it for granted. So we don't seem to have the reverence that perhaps this side of the planet may have, number one. And number two, this idea of self-publishing, and kind of people are self-publishing and having their works available on Amazon, which seems quite hypocritical, given that it's an autonomous expression, and yet we're using this huge mass marketing machine to get the word out. So I just wondered how you felt about that, or what reflections you have about that.
Sure. So I'll just try to cover that really briefly, because I know we have to also keep things rolling. But right. So I'm skeptical about my own distinction between the American encounter with a book as a mass-produced object, because I think we also have to recognize that there are more public libraries in the United States than really anywhere else in the world. So there is this reverence for access to books. And of course, the one thing that I totally ignored here is how enjoyable old books are, and I really appreciate that kind of, looking at decrepit books on a shelf as something that's really valuable. But as for, I don't necessarily think a lot about self-publishing. I think it's, it really is an individual or more idiosyncratic thing, whether that's good or not. I don't know if it's good in and of itself. But I think underlying that is a much broader conversation about the experience of books electronically as opposed to as physical objects. And that's why I say, I'm just much more interested in the experience of books as physical objects.
We have a question from Alex in the chat. Brandon, I have a technical question. What did you use for elastics in the binding of the travel journal? I have had a hard time finding archival elastic. It eventually breaks down after a few years. Frowny face, frowny face.
Ah, um, so I don't think that mine are archival either. I just, unfortunately, I mean, I think you could look at Talus maybe. I could put that in the or I could send that to you directly. But there are a lot of conservation materials if you're familiar with them. They're based in Brooklyn actually. Um, but this is part of the thing, right? I was trying to get at this, that some materials I've definitely had to improvise with, and it doesn't make for always the most beautiful object or the most functional object. But you know, one of the reasons why I like bookbinding is because I like to have nice things on no budget. It's like a DIY mentality, right? It's like, how can I have nice things without any money? And how can I have nice books without any materials? Um, you know, I've just got some elastics off of, I think, Etsy, from some craft suppliers and things like that. But you could try Talus. They might have some.
Alice, like TA.
Yeah, I'm gonna send you the. I can't remember the exact. I'm gonna drop it in the chat.
Great, thank
Okay.
you.
You're welcome.
Does anyone else have any questions for Brandon before we move to our break?
Real quick, I already put Brandon's Instagram in the chat, but if somebody is not on Instagram, Brandon, what's the best way for them to either get in touch with you or follow your work? Maybe, I don't know, Facebook or something like that, if you have any suggestions.
Yeah, thank you. So I do have a Facebook page, which is also this, I think, the same handle at Write and Bind. And then I'm also going to actually put my Gmail for that, which is just writeandbind@gmail.com. It's all the same. So you can absolutely send me an email. I'd love to. I love talking about this stuff. So that's a way you can connect with me. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I'll try to find, if you can actually post it, or I'll check it and we'll post like a link to the Facebook option as well. That would be great. Sure. But without further ado, if there's no other questions, I think we will segue into a break. Does anyone have any final comments or anything they would like to add?
Yes, I would like him to make me a notebook. I will treasure it forever. Brandon, I'll send you an email. Thank you.
Great, of course. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Brent. It's Gabby. Hi, thank you so much. This was great. I like making books too, so we should hang out. I met my best friend at library book camp in 8th grade.
No kidding. All right.
Yep, we made books together. All right. Thanks, everybody.
All right, thank you. Bye.
All right. Thank you so much again, everyone, for being here. Don't go away. We're going to take just a quick 5-minute break just to stretch your legs, grab some water, and we'll be back in just about 5 minutes, and we'll hear from Alex and what she has to share with us about her practice. So thank you all so much. As we're waiting, I'm actually going to share my screen, just a couple of images actually that kind of show like a Polish side from Molzak, which is the Museum of Contemporary Art in Krakow. And they have a whole library that's dedicated to old books and some handmade books. So I'll show a couple images of that. Also, I know we have a couple of bookmakers here, like Isa. If you want to throw your info in the chat, we'd love to check out everyone's work. So thank you so much, and see you in 5 minutes. Everyone, sorry for the delay. I thought it was screen sharing and it wasn't, but here's just a couple of short images of different handmade books, zines, magazines, different things that are part of the Multac, which is the Museum of Contemporary Art in Krakow, part of their permanent library collection. So I'm putting the link in the chat if you're interested in getting more information. But some of these books and magazines are from many, many decades ago. So feel free to check it out.
Do you guys have any medium heavy boxes up there? Not heavy, but I could just use.
Hey everyone, we're slowly getting back to it here. As people will start tuning back in, I just wanted to reiterate a little bit of information about what I'm sharing on the screen. To give a little bit of ode to the Polish side of things, I wanted to share a couple images from the Museum of Contemporary Art in Krakow, Multac. I've been partnering with them since my Fulbright grant, which was in 2019-2020. Which I still cooperate with them today. And they have a fantastic library of various very old books, handmade artist books, magazines, zines, you name it, they probably have it. And not just from Polish artists, but international artists. So I put the link on the screen and also in the chat so you can easily access it if you would like more information. If you ever find yourself in Krakow or if you're here, highly recommend a visit to it. So thank you for that. I'm gonna go ahead and slowly start passing it over to Jack. Thank you so much again for moderating the Q&A with Brandon. It was so great to hear from Brandon and all of his work in bookbinding and his philosophies behind making, even more about his experience and background in bookmaking. So thank you once again, Brandon. So I'll just pass the floor over to you, Jack.
Thank you, Joanna. Yeah, and this is a great discussion, and I love even the statement Brandon made that what does making books create? relationships, and here we are like establishing new relationships today. So it's cool that even the very forum is becoming an opportunity for making relationships through art. So with that, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Alex Bildsoe. I first met Alex when she was working with visitor services at the Museum of Food and Drink in Brooklyn. And I knew her to be an excellent baker. And we talked about baking because I also do some baking. And we talked about baking. We talked about art and what it means to be an artist. So it's been a treat to know Alex and to be exposed to her work. Her zine is the new Manifesto, and you can subscribe to it. Let me drop the link in here on alexandrabildso.com. Okay, of course. I go. You know when you like copy a link and and then it pastes the like ridiculous long version of it that's like encrypted with whatever code they add to it. It's like, okay, dude, that's just like, why do you have to do that to me right now?
I'm also going to add her Instagram if you're wanting to follow her there. And okay, perfect. We have the website too.
Yeah, so that her information is in the chat. Her zines are amazing. I mean, the new Manifesto is filled with charming creativity and just incredibly imaginative. I'm just blown away every time I see a new issue. Alex is primarily an illustrator, writer, and baker. She writes about the world around her, both real and imagined, in intricate detail. And her visual work often follows in style, using both intricate line work and a childlike sensibility. Her insatiable curiosity has led her to break down the world into the tiniest particles, then build a world out from there. Often, cuisine and food sensory/ritual experiences are woven into this work. She received a studio arts degree from Beloit College and a master's degree in authorial illustration from Falmouth University. Without any further ado, Alex, thank you for being with us today.
Hi, thank you. That was that was an amazing introduction. Thank you, Jack. Can everyone hear me all right? Yes?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, great. So I just put my timer on and there we go. So I'm gonna screen share with you. Get going with that. Yeah. Okay. So when I was preparing this presentation, I started going back in times, like further and further, because as I thought about the zine, I was like, when did the zine start? Like, when did I actually start doing this? When did the seeds of it, like, where are they in my life? And at one point I was like, literally back like 20 years, 30 years, like just going back to like when I was a child, because I was like, everything in my life has like led up to the zine. And it's kind of interesting to see how it's coalesced, but I'm just going to sort of like give a brief outline. Well, yeah, a few things. Oh man, it's like, where do I even start? I just wanted to say that the cool thing about having these Zoom presentations is you can just grab stuff off your shelf, when you want to show something. I collect zines, and so I just have like a bunch of zines here. And for people who don't know what they are, there's like such a huge range of quality, paper type, how they're printed, length, but generally the idea is that they are just like a printer paper size, folded, and either stapled, sewn, or rubber banded together. That's like generally the idea. And then there's another model that's kind of also, it looks like a book like this, but you actually have it from one sheet of paper. So you do all the work on one side and then you fold it up. So those are like the two kind of basic zine forms. So I'll just get into this because I've got a lot to go through. So I started drawing when I was a kid, and then I studied fine art in my undergraduate, and I did photography. So that's sort of like where all this comes from, is photography. But I think about like 4 years after I graduated and did other things, I started drawing again. And when I started drawing this jellyfish. I don't know where it came from. I just was doodling, and this jellyfish started coming out, and it became like my character. And I drew the jellyfish doing all sorts of different things, you know, being naughty, usually like getting into stuff that it wasn't supposed to be getting into. And that was great. So I did that for a few years, and then I went, well, also at the same time, I was doing a lot of like commission work, and then just work for my own friends doing posters for shows, for story nights. I was running a storytelling night as well, and doing all the posters for that. And I just loved the ephemeral quality of the posters. Like, I'd make them, I'd photocopy them, and within a week they would be a piece of paper that you would recycle. Like, I really liked that kind of they had this quality that kind of reminds me of food in a way. It's like it has a limited use and it will break down very quickly. And also you can reuse it, you know, like use it for scrap paper. My friend who's also a zinester just like writes me his letters on the back of like show posters. Just love that, like stuff like that, repurposing it. And so anyway, that's those. And this is a little frame from the comic strip that I do in the new manifesto called Small Circles. And you'll recognize the jellyfish as the jelly. And then this other character who's listening to the flower is Y. And I could do a probably 3-hour presentation on Y alone, because Y is a part of me. And yeah, they like live inside me. So about 8 years ago, I was grading standardized tests for kids all across the country, writing tests, history, and social studies. And during that time, you know, be sitting for 8 hours in front of a computer screen, reading kids' essays, and just really funny things. And kind of like, I enjoyed it so much, I would take notes about what they were writing about, because it's like, what's a 9-year-old's perspective on, you know, the treasure they find in their backyard, and like reading that over and over again for 3 weeks. But one of the things that came out of it was there was a section on ancient Sumeria, and I started looking up ancient Sumerian art, and this sculpture with these like big eyes kept coming up. And I just started drawing Y. This is the first time I ever drew Y. This was like on a piece of scrap paper from Data Recognition Corporation. Whoa, that is a whole different topic. So anyway, after after Y came about, I started drawing this character without understanding why Y was appearing, and growing to love them more and more. They hadn't met the jellyfish yet, though. So that leads me up to going back to school in the UK for illustration. And this was my project there. My master's thesis was about flavor and how we experience flavor, and how that relates to text image theory, and also kind of the practice of illustrating, like what that means, and how flavor is something that we take as such a I mean, now in the last like 10 years, there's been so many more studies about like, what's the word, like gastronomic kind of things and like smelling and how that relates to it. But yeah, what I was really interested in is how the stories in your own mind affect how we experience flavor. So this is a room that I painted like the inside of a mouth with all of these taste buds, and then these images are microscopic images of food. So I'm not going to dwell too much on that, but this is like the first kind of official zine that I did, and that had my thesis in it, and it was a newspaper, so it was also like an ephemeral piece of paper. Here's a just sort of like a little taste of the research that I did into what affects our perception of food. And a lot of these terms I made up or I borrowed from neuropsychology. So again, we won't go too deeply into that. But alongside of doing my thesis project, I started talking a lot with poets in the town that I was living in, and I ended up doing a lot of illustrated poetry and ended up writing a lot more poetry. And there's a huge, in like the zine world, there's a kind of a corner of the zine world that is illustrated poetry or poets publishing their own work called chapbooks. It's like a small collection of poems, you know, written by someone, printed out, and that's like a chapbook. And anyway, oh my God, there's just like so much to talk about. It's crazy. All right. So this is an illustration I did for a journal that this poem was published in the UK. And so after I did my master's in the UK, I came and lived in Brooklyn, and I was really fascinated by all of the mail systems in New York. I mean, I've always loved mail. I have a tattoo of a postage stamp perforation on my arm. I just find it's like the most interesting, exciting way to communicate because it's physical. It's like, I feel like one of the few communications left that there has to be a person involved somewhere in it, and they have to hold it. And a piece of mail can get damaged. It can get lost. You know, it's like it can find people in the middle of nowhere in rural areas, PO boxes, mail people walking around with bags of mail. I mean, it seems so archaic. It's like I feel so lucky to be alive in a time that mail still exists. Anyway, that's mail. And then on the left is a picture of an egg on a photocopier, which is a reminder to say that photocopying is always something that's been really interesting to me. Because of photography, and using a photocopier is taking a photograph with a fixed camera. And I found that I've always used photocopying and scanning as a form of photography in my work. And again, we don't even have time to go into that, but that's a whole nother thing. So all this is leading up to something. I was a photographer for Curlew Quarterly. It was about like 5 years ago in Brooklyn, and the editor would go interview people and I would take photos of the interview, and that got me super excited about doing interviews and thinking about how to encapsulate the essence of someone or take an idea or kind of an ethos of what a person is doing with their life or what they have to say and incorporate that into a publication. So that brings us to the zine. The new manifesto I started in the summer of 2018 when I was back visiting the UK. And at the time, this is the original publication, which I bound with elastics, which all fell apart. So now they're unbound completely. but this is risograph printed, and I'm not going to go into what a risograph printer is, but it's pretty awesome. Look into it. There's Y on the cover. So the original format was taking a manifesto and then basing the whole zine around that. It could be a manifesto from a friend, from history, something that I made up. This one was a manifesto made up by a friend in the UK. Each zine has an interview with the person, a piece of writing by myself, usually kind of like an editorial piece, and now it's all fiction. And then Small Circles, the comic. And a bunch of illustrations. This is the first illustration I did for that. So anyway, here's Y and Jelly, where they meet in small circles, and they meet during the first zine. You kind of like see them in the first together in one place. So the way that I bind these and put them together is they're all photocopied now. The first zine was the only one risograph printed, but I photograph every page, and every zine is laid out by hand. So as opposed to doing it on Photoshop or using Microsoft Word, or it's all like I cut and paste everything, and then I photocopy it and collate it by hand, which is just really fun. It just involves like sitting down with a cup of tea for a few hours and shuffling papers and using a long arm stapler, which is I highly suggest. Here's just some close-ups for the first issue. Here is one very small circles strip, which kind of gives you an idea of the spirit of Jelly and Y. They're two parts of myself. So Y is sort of like this childlike part of me that I think existed before I existed, like has come through my mother's womb from another place in the universe, and that's who Y is. And Y is always inside of me whenever, all through the day, and whenever I have a question or anything, they're always there. And then the Jelly is sort of like it's sort of like kind of a curious but sort of naughty, like teenage self of me, I think, slash a little bit more cynical. And so they sort of have an engagement, like they're always talking, and that's like their little adventures. So here's some pictures of the process. Very romantic, a lot of glue, a lot of tape. I go through washi tape like you wouldn't believe. And I do runs of 50 now, and so 50 zines per run, and I think I'm on zine 16 or 17. Originally, for the first year, I did them for every moon cycle, which was 13 in a year, which is a lot of work. But now I'm just doing them sort of when I can, and I'm desperately due to have another one out. But this was, I think it was like issue 4 or 5, about the soul and what I asked some people in my life what they think the soul is and where it comes from and where it goes, and I printed those in there. This was an issue about bread, and I included a little bit of my own sourdough starter that was dried up in an envelope, so that anyone who got the zine would also get that. Here's an example of one of my many experimentations with food and printmaking. Got some sourdough that I'm using as stamps, which is really fun. And I want to try with different foods too, but it works awesome with like nice sourdough. This was the AI issue, and the whole issue was generated by various AIs online. So this is actually like the Y image that's curled up is a 0, and the Y image that's standing up straight is a 1. And so this is binary code, and it says the new manifesto over and over again. So that was the cover of the AI issue. And then these are AI generated inspirational like boxes like from online that are so funny. If you want to laugh, go online and look at AI generated stuff. AI generated recipes, inspirational quotes, like books. It's just like endless. And you can have conversations with AIs. And that was the interview. So I interviewed this like really smart, like supposedly smart AI, and that was printed in the zine, and so much fun. This was a collaboration I did with the Museum of Food and Drink, which was the community cookbook project where I did surveys with people who came in to visit the museum. I was working at the front desk, and I had a whole survey sheet laid out, like, you know, what do you like to cook? Who do you cook with? What's your favorite recipe that you've made up? You know, kind of like what's your first food memory? And so some people would come in and fill out these papers, and then I think I got about 80 of them, and I collated them and edited them down and printed a bunch of them out in the issue of the zine. And the paper, they're kind of a special edition of the zine. The covers are all hand marbled. I got into hand marbling, which is really fun. Highly suggest. Here's an example of a page. So if you see like the questions, like where are you from, what, like one word that describes food. Anyway, those are the answers for this one person. And the recipe is French fries and a hot dog. That's the recipe, which is pretty fun. This zine, it was the Spoon zine and another zine that completely changed. Actually, no, it was 3 zines: the Spoon zine, the New Yorker zine, and the Appendix zine that completely changed what the new manifesto is. So last year, at the beginning of 2020, I completely shifted my format. So instead of having an interview and a piece of writing and small circles, it's mostly fiction that I'm writing and small circles. I just started doing fiction last year, and I'm absolutely loving it. And I think it's the zine that has led me in that direction. And the Spoon issue came out sometime last year, but what was cool about it is it ended up getting published in, this is another image from the Spoon issue. It got published in a magazine here in the Hudson Valley called Chronogram, and I wrote this fiction piece about an imagined history of spoons, that they came from outer space, and there's this whole elaborate history, a mythology around how spoons got here and how they're trained to do their job as spoons. And it got published, and I got super, it just like kind of it generated all this energy around my fiction writing that got me really excited. And just the end of 2019, I think, was what truly sparked this off. I had appendicitis, had like a medical emergency, and had my appendix out. And for 2 weeks, I wasn't able to work, and I had these amazing painkillers. And I wrote the craziest stuff, and I printed it in this zine, and it's one of my favorite zines. I wrote like a mini play, like a screenplay. I did some weird like surreal fiction, and it sort of like broke me through. I was doing this kind of writing before that was like opinion pieces and essays, educational or like academic essays, which is really fun. But I'd always wanted to do fiction, and that that experience, like that really intense physical experience, I think just like pushed me forcefully through that. So that was a blessing. And this comes to kind of how COVID has changed the way I work and like what I'm doing. So when COVID hit March 14th, I lost my job of last year, and I was working as a baker in a cafe. And then I basically was unemployed for 3 months, and I had so much time to myself. It was unreal. I live alone and I love my apartment. So my apartment started to become my entire world. And I had this sort of thought that everything in the world, my world, was happening in my apartment or on my front stoop. And I sort of thought, what would a publication look like from the world of 190 Fair Street? And I started thinking about The New Yorker, which is one of my favorite magazines. So I did a spoof off of that, the new Manifesto, which is took the form of The New Yorker, but it's all based on events in my apartment. And the major event was when the sugar ants discovered the kitchen counter, and it was a bloodbath. I mean, I didn't I didn't kill them, but in my mind I was seeing red. It was scary, but it was such a huge event for me, like that the ants were taking over my kitchen. So I wrote a whole story where my stuffed animal bunny is the reporter who's doing a very serious investigation into these ants. And I'm just checking my time here. 1 minute. Okay. And so this is sort of a little image of my process. The way I illustrate, I often take photos of things that I'm going to be illustrating and then use those as reference for my drawing. And you can see in the picture here how I've cut. I cut the words and my hand drawings, and then I photocopy that directly. So you can see that from image to completion. And yeah, so basically what COVID did for my work was it completely allowed me to immerse myself in my own creative process for 3 or 4 months. And I was blessed to get unemployment, and I got a new job, which I love 10 million times more than the last job I had. So COVID for me has been, I am very privileged, and it's been a gift in so many ways. And it's messed up that I'm saying that, because I know it's not a gift, but that's what it's been like for my creative process. It just happens. And then these last two were just kind of other things that I've been doing since COVID. I started working with color for the first time in my life. I never thought I could use color because I felt like it was too complicated for me. So I started using color, and now I'm like obsessed with gel pens. So that's it. I think that's the end. Oh, right. This is the final image of Y with my pet snake, Floriani. And this was just another example of another way that I interact with my subscribers. So the people who subscribe to my zine, I also send out like little cards and stuff. And this was the last card I sent out saying, I'll send zines eventually. Anyway, that was super fun and really fast. And I feel like I could have talked for 5 more hours, but I'm going to stop now.
Thank you so much, Alex. I feel like we're giving you a little round of applause. The story in this apartment, where the big story in this apartment right now is the applause that we're giving you.
Big fans of Alex.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much, Alex. I just have to chime in. That was so fascinating. And I really appreciated how you structured your talk, and you talked about all these different elements of your work. And I see we have a lot of raised hands too, and comments in the chat, which is super exciting. Jack is our moderator, so I want to give him the floor, but because we're short on time, I also want to offer, if anyone needs to go, if they want to ask a question first or a comment, please just go on ahead. I think we had a raised hand first from Kira, and then from Annalise, and then Shauna. So feel free to ask your question if you need to go imminently.
If someone needs to go, they can just jump in and interrupt me too. But I just want to give a shout out to Alex, who is an incredible illustrator, and I have the gift of receiving her artistry here in Minnesota. And Alex, you actually did answer the question that was in my mind about how have you evolved with the evolution of your artwork. I think that you really touched on that. But I am curious for you to share more about where do you see it evolving from here? Like now that the world is evolving through COVID, like what is your next up leveling of your artistry evolution?
Thanks, Kira. That's my best friend right there. New mother and best friend. Thank you, Kira. That's a really good question. Yeah, I think I'm asking myself that question, which is why I haven't made a zine in 6 months, and I usually make one like every couple months. And what's been a gift is actually there's a woman who is a poet who has been spending time in our bakery to write poems about baking and bread. And she was kind of like, I don't know how to make zines. I want to publish my poems. So we're going to collaborate on the next zine, and I'm going to publish her poems and then also kind of turn to a zine. So it's been kind of fun to imagine and kind of fantasize about doing more of that collaborative work. I think on one hand, there's that. And then the other hand is I want to start writing fiction, like more fiction, like dive deeper into that, because I feel like I've just touched the surface. And I also feel like another avenue was I could just do small circles for the rest of my life, that comic strip. So I don't know if I can answer your question, Kira. It's like I feel like I'm at a crossroads.
I'm gonna put a plug for you to do more children's stories too.
Oh, says the teacher. Thank you.
Thank you again for that great question. Again, I want to sort of move along and be sensitive in case people do need to go. So we had Annalise next, which I know you have to go very soon. So let's have you do your question, and then we'll pass the floor along again.
So Joanna kind of answered my mundane question, but I think if somebody were to ask me, what would you take on a desert island? I would say Brandon and Alex. Because if these two people can create this I don't even know the word, like mastery and magic, and they find collating paper with a stapler and sitting for hours. I don't remember what Brandon said. And I thought, oh my God, either these people are just like have brains on them, because I just have that comment. I mean, a baker, a writer, an illustrator, I'd like their brains. Is it possible that I could have a transplant right now? Like seriously, I feel so inept and inadequate, really. And of course, I want to be on her mailing list, just like I'm going to ask him to make a notebook. Just really, I just have to really say that, because it's just, I appreciate the passion. So my logistical question was just marbling. And then Joanna's mentioned, I said, oh yes, I've seen this kind of paper. But just the idea that someone, an artist, can create, a bunny watching ants and sugar. I'm just like, what the hell? Like, I just want a brain transplant. May I have a brain? I would like a brain transplant. Could I will go on record. You could put this here. I would like, and if they were at a desert island, people like this, because collating with a stapler, I'm sorry, I've done that as a volunteer activity and I've wanted to shoot myself. So if this lady can do something with a magical bunny watching ants and sugar, I'm all in. So she's got me on her mailing list. Done. Just got to say that.
Thank you. Very sweet.
I think we all copy you on that, Annalise. I think we all would love to have just even a smidgen of Alex's brain. That's amazing.
No, I'm just like, I'm I'm sorry, I've just got to go on. Like baking, what the hell is she using as stamps? Stuff to make bread? I heard that. I almost had to have her repeat it. I was like, this woman is thinking about making yeast and using it as a stamp or a starter. She said a start. I thought, I've never heard that in my entire life. This person has to go with me on a desert island. Done.
Well, I love tropical vacations, so you're in luck.
Shauna, you have a question?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm actually a friend of Brandon. I've known him for about 10, well, I guess 11 years now. But I'm so glad that I hopped on here for Alex because I'm in awe of you. And something that really struck me, and Annalise mentioned it, is that you're an illustrator, you're dabbling in writing, you have design, like you have all of these creative outlets. And I wonder about you balancing them or how you feel that they come out, and like struggling to be like, am I giving enough room and enough time for one thing and another? Because I feel the same way. I'm a printmaker, I'm a writer, you know, you can see the wall behind me. So I know how that feels. And I just wonder, because I know that you have far more experience than I do. And I just wonder, how do you balance all of that, not only in your mind, but emotionally, and then how you externalize it? Is it an intentional thing? Do you set time for different avenues? You know, I know that the design is very versatile, so I'm assuming that helps a little bit, but I just wonder how you balance it all and how you let it come out and, you know, feel like you're doing all of your creative facets justice.
I feel like that's a question that I ask myself. I've been asking myself since I was 12.
Yep. Me too.
But I mean, I guess I feel like I've used this analogy before, but for me, like if you imagine like squeezing Play-Doh and how it comes out your fingers and it comes out, like it'll just like come out eventually, like the more you squeeze, it just like starts squirting out. It's like the Play-Doh is my creativity and the hand is my life. It's just like it will just come out any which way. Like anything I touch, like whatever project I start, it'll just like turn into my practice, which is really, like you touched on it, like it can be overwhelming because it's like, how do you, I have like the supplies here for so many different kinds of media. It's insane. Like my studio is just like, I have like leatherworking, marbling, book binding, like all sorts of, like a typewriter, like computer printing, multiple, like paper, just like, it's just insane. But I guess what I'm trying to say is with the zine's been really helpful because I am the sole decider of what goes in it. So if I have been producing a lot of visual work, like drawing over the last few months, then it can be more of that. And if I've been doing more writing, it can be more heavy on the writing. If I haven't been creative at all, I can interview people and I can like take snippets of other people's work. And I think the thing about the zine that's been really also has been good, kind of on the opposite or the other side of that coin, is that because I know that I want it to have some element of writing and some element of visual work, it's just pushed me to do both of those, which is what I studied. I mean, my master's was in authorial illustration, which is focusing on illustration where you're doing the writing and the drawing. So it's like image making and writing at the same time. And a lot of the, like a lot of graphic novelists, people who are doing their own illustrated poetry, children's books. So there is, my mind has started to coalesce around text, image, like how those two work together constantly. And I mean, look at the way that we take in text and images today on social media. It's always like, they're always images illustrating words and words illustrating images. Like they're almost impossible to separate. And so where would the question begin with was, how do I balance it? Right. There's no answer. It's really hard. It's
So
kind
I'm
of
not
hard.
the only one, is basically what I'm just
Yeah.
checking in. I'm
There's-
just checking in, making sure I'm not the only one here.
Oh, totally. It can be really frustrating, and definitely there are times, because I do so many mediums, where I feel like I've neglected
Yes.
something for a very long time, and it can get kind of like a little bit sad. Like, I'm looking at my leather work. I used to be a leather worker, and I haven't touched it in like 5 years, and anyway, it's a whole other, but yeah.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And thank you for the solidarity.
Oh, yeah, it's good to hear other creatives be like, have the same, because I see people who are like, I've been painting every day for the last 50 years. And you're like, good job.
Yeah.
This is so validating. Thank you all so much. I think everyone on this call and everyone who will be listening afterwards will be grateful for the validation and affirmation. So thank you.
So we have a mundane question, a self-described mundane question from Brandon Harrington. Do you have your own photocopier, or do you use someone else's?
Whoa, good question. I love how we're asking each other the technical questions. That's so cool. Yeah, I mean, if anyone wants to know what to get me for my birthday, it's coming up at the end of July. It would be like 1990s Xerox machine. They're probably like $10,000 or more. And they're like the size of a closet, basically. But I would love to have my own photocopier. No, you know what's funny is, like, I had a printer with a scanner, and, like, you know, it's like functions like a photocopier, but it was like $300 for a little while, and I hated it. I hated the way the zines looked. It looked dumb. I can't even explain it. Like, it totally lost that spark. Like, I do all of my printing at the local art shop. They have these ancient Xerox machines, and the sound, the smell, the way the paper goes through it's like a very distinct thing. The fact that I'm there for like an hour printing off like 500 sheets of, you know, copied paper, and the people know me and I know the copy machine. It's just like a whole thing that I love. And I would love to have a copy machine in my house. But at the same time, like, when you look at the history of zines and what they were about and how they worked, it was like they're photocopied because that was accessible for anyone, and they were so cheap. And, like, going, especially black and white, I mean, I can do a run of 50 zines, 8 pages. So what is that, like, fucking, I don't know, like, they're like between 20 and 40 pages, essentially, like individual pages. And I can do it for under $60 if I don't do color, which is insane when you think about that. Like printing 50 books, you know, for under whatever. I'm going on a tangent, but the bottom line is, there's something nice about having the Xerox machine, the copy machine, as a community object that is available to anyone. And it's something that you know, so many times I've like opened up the copy machine and there's someone else's stuff in there they forgot, you know, and then you pull it out and it's like, you know, like a car, like, I don't know, I'm, again, another tangent, but I enjoy the object of it as a public space. And that's part of the zine culture as well, which is pretty cool.
Well, thank you so much, Alex. I don't know if I can like add too much to the questions that have been asked and to what you have said yourself. I also have like a flood of kids now, just like vying for space on my lap. It's very, very funny. Yeah, I mean, I wanted to ask you about, you know, stories influencing flavor and then flavor influencing art. And I wanted to ask you about why is Y named Y. And I wanted to ask you about using...
I can tell you that really, really quickly. Why is Y named Y? Because there's a Y right here in their, like, you know, do you see what I mean? Like the Y that's like right here.
Yeah, like the internal silhouette.
Wow,
Oh,
that's a.
wow.
Yeah,
I'm
that's it.
glad I even just alluded to that question, because like that is like, but like there's obviously like a double meaning there,
Of course, of
like,
course.
like curiosity and whatnot. The sourdough as stamps, I was also kind of blown away by that. Your incorporation of AI, I was blown away by. I mean, I think every single thing, it's so much the imagination behind it. You know, it's like the charm, but also like the like literally who would have thought of that? Except it's so obvious, except it's not obvious at all, you know, like so instead of like asking you all of like the million questions that I have, I'm going also to stick to a more mundane question, because I too am somebody who really appreciates the tactile engagement with art. And you, I mean, you have like, because I'm a photographer, but I shoot film photography, and I love shooting the photos, but the time consuming thing is not shooting the photos. It is I mean, that can be time consuming obviously, but it's the cutting up the frames, putting that, like cataloging them, putting them you know, in the archives that I have, scanning them. I had a scanner. I've stopped using it because it made my photos look dumb. You know, and it was like weirdly like it was like if you had colored it in with crayon or something, it just looked weird. Um, so I want to ask you about the like that kind of painstaking hours and hours and hours of just very mundane work of like using your hands, not even to create the art per se, but to just put it together in a manageable format. Like, what is that experience like for you?
Oh my God, that's such a good question. It relates to so many things about my work. So, I mean, the way you described that, I was thinking that's exactly what I do at the bakery. You know, like hours and hours every day of doing the same physical movement over and over again, just folding dough, rolling out dough, you know, measuring flour, just all this stuff. I find that um I am someone with anxiety, and I find a lot of comfort in getting lost in a mundane task. And I think that there's something about making zines and making books, because I mean, I really came to zine making through bookbinding. And um, as soon as I started bookbinding, I knew that there was something interesting about how my mind would calm after sort of working. I mean, the way that Brandon described it is sort of like complex, like it takes skills, but it's also weirdly intuitive physically. And the the act of sitting at my table and cutting out every word block for, you know, 30 pages of the zine, and like organizing them into piles and then meticulously taping them onto each page, it's like the most satisfying thing in the world. And so yeah, I enjoy it. I enjoy every step of the process, and I also like it that it's multi-stepped. And I also started like my first I started photography doing darkroom photography, so I totally know what you mean. Like there's all of these very time consuming tasks that sort of like get you to a very like small endpoint. You're like, oh, okay, cool. I have this like single image after 40 hours of you know. But it's like baking too. It's just there's all of these things you have your hand in, and it are actually very simple. And then when you kind of add it up to the larger whole, there's a lot of things left up to fate and chance. and that's kind of also what I like about zines and this whole process where it's very quick, like the turnaround time with the zines. It's like I can't be focused on the perfection of it, which is a place where and I know a lot of other artists get really caught up in is wanting everything to be perfect before they can put it out into the world, which I totally get. But it was sort of it.
Well, thank you so much. Excuse me. That really was a most illuminating and amazing presentation. To kind of close this out for questions, I know we're kind of like running a little bit late on time, I think. Debbie here has a question for both speakers. So Debbie, you want to start by asking Alex?
Hi, Alex.
Hi, Debbie.
Yeah, I'll this is a question that came to mind during your presentation, Alex, but I would also love if Brandon wants to answer it as well, for him to hop in after. Alex, something I appreciate about you both as an artist and as a friend of mine is your perspective on just like humanity and your perspective on like intimacy. You're someone that I think of when I think of the idea of sharing like vulnerable parts of yourself with strangers. You're someone that comes to mind, and you've written about that in some of these zines. You know, you mentioned the issue you had on like the soul, and you did a whole issue about your experiences at Burning Man. And I mean, the appendix issue where like you had your appendix out, I was so struck by just like the vulnerability of that whole experience and you sharing it with people. I mean, some people who get the new manifesto are like good friends of yours, but presumably maybe some are not. And I think as artists, we always have the desire in some way to be vulnerable publicly, but it's hard to know sometimes like where that line is. And then there are times like COVID that make vulnerability feel almost like necessary to keep going because of just how hard everything is and how connected we need to feel with people, even if we can't be in the same room with them. So I know that's not like really a question, but I guess I would love to hear your reflections on like whether it's like the boundaries that you set around your own personal like vulnerability or like public intimacy, or just your thoughts on like what it means as an artist to be like intimate with an audience or to be so vulnerable with an audience, or someone that you're making art with or art for. And then Brandon, if you had any thoughts on that as well, I would appreciate your perspective too. Does that prompt even make sense?
Yeah, it does. I got distracted because I was like, I think Brandon's gone. And then I was like, is Joanna gone too? And then I was like, where are we? What's happening? Are people like, so like, I like phased out for a second, but that's actually that's a really interesting question. And I think the thing behind the zine that obviously my subscribers don't know because they just see the final product is in many of the issues I struggle with what I put in it, like how transparent I want to be about my own life or my own feelings about things, or like how personal I want the information to be. And I've definitely, because the tradition of zines themselves, a lot of them are like radical self-expression and radical transparency, where they're just super raw, like just raw dog info, like whoa, bodily, like sexual, religious, like all the things that are just like taboo, they're just like boom right there. And I think I've sort of had, it's been an interesting thing because of my subscribers. Like my mom is a subscriber, you know, like I have like all these subscribers of like people who like know me very well. And so I would probably print something different if I was just printing an article like in a publication, or if I was writing my own book, and I don't know, I just, on the other hand, I found it to be really freeing because I have actually put things in the zine where I thought, oh, this is like a lot for me. And then after printing it, then people reaching out and being like, wow, thanks for saying that. I really connected with that. So it's just like a learning experience. I think I'm pushing my own boundaries constantly. I'm not the type to like get mental and like throw my hat like so far over the fence that I can't see it. I'm kind of more of like a little inch by inch type of thing. And it's helpful and it's awesome. It's been rewarding. So I guess that sort of answers it.
Thank you, Alex. Brandon, do you have thoughts as well?
So I need to say that I was just running around my apartment trying to find where the internet would actually connect for me. So I'm really sorry, but I totally don't know what the question was.
That's okay. It was only like a 5-minute long reflection and multi-part question.
Okay.
I was really just asking for y'all's thoughts on like vulnerability and intimacy, like through your craft, and you know, like what it means as an artist to be like really vulnerable or really intimate, like sometimes with strangers or sometimes through like across long distances, and whether your practice has made you reflect on that, especially in a time where like we've been so isolated from each other and trying to find new ways to like connect and be vulnerable.
Great question. Thank you so much. And I have something to say about it. So good communication here. So one of the things that I feel most vulnerable about really is making books for other people, because it is such a technical craft, and I don't have tools that allow me to achieve the level of refinement that I want out of a book. So you know, a lot of the bookmakers who I follow and a lot of the books that I see online that people have hand bound, I think are just better. To be honest, like I think they look better. I'm sure that they have more material integrity and things like that. I don't necessarily have access to all of those materials that I'd like to achieve the kind of product that I like. So I feel very vulnerable in sharing my work as a finished product because I'm not happy with it. But that and also like allows me to continue like slowly building that integrity. You know, maybe this explains also why I really hate to use the notebooks that I create, because I look at them and I see their flaws, and but at the same time, something that I've learned from the process of bookbinding is, as I mentioned in my presentation, that often book structures conceal their own means of construction. Part of the artistry, I think, is learning how to better conceal your own mistakes, and still create book objects that are highly functional and enjoyable to use and whatnot. So I suppose it's given me bookbinding has also lent some resources in terms of getting over my own vulnerabilities. I've kind of learned how to save face and make something that I can still stand behind and be proud of.
Thank you, Brandon.
And as we know from the great artist Bob Ross, there is no such thing as mistakes. There are only happy accidents. So thank you so much, Brandon and Alex, for your incredible presentations. They were very enriching for my day, and I'm sure that they have been very enriching for the days of the other participants. We will now be going into a closed participant section of the event. So for those of you who are not part of the Solidarity Art Project participant team, thank you for joining us. Thank you so much for tuning in, and join next month for the next event that we will have. We have one of these at the last Saturday of every month. So look forward to hearing from us about what we're planning for June. Joanna, do you want to add anything?
Just thank you once again for joining and for staying on so late. We really appreciate that. one quick note is the recording for this event will be posted on our YouTube channel within the next 24 hours. So stay tuned for that. I've posted many links in the chat, so apologies. I'll post the YouTube channel link directly if you would like to go straight there. I have a link on my personal website that has a section for this project. There will be a website, a unique website for it at the end of the project timeline with the virtual exhibition. So that's all for us today, but definitely do join us for the next event next month. We'll be posting details of that in the next couple of weeks. So thank you all so much for being here. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.